Welcome to the 6th video in our series on realism and RPG combat, where we are going over and then doing some commentary on the essay by John Clements from 2003, and in this video we're going to be talking about narrating combat to preserve realism and suspense. So let's go on. Those were his 5 key points, and then he continues on with some other commentary. Notice nowhere in these suggested 5 key points have I addressed anything about game mechanics or weapon or armor statistics. That's not my concern. I leave that up to the innovative game designers and their respective players. With regard to hit points, I am also not concerned. In real life, we just have 1 hit point, and if we lose it, we're gone. But clearly, people of different builds and body sizes and even temperaments can withstand varying ranges of physical trauma more so than others. But in a game, for playability, we need abstraction, and thus, virtually any system for accounting for hit points is acceptable. Okay, yeah, we're not talking about statistics here for weapons or armor, and we could really get into the hit point stuff, and of course a lot of people have in a lot of places, but I don't think here is the time to really dig into a hit point discussion, so that was his opinion on the subject. He goes on, some game masters like to rely on a chart or different table to answer every possible combat situation and incorporate rules down to a science specific for every kind of specific action or attack called. To me, this is an overly technical approach that considerably distorts realism instead of helping it. This sounds like a critique of Rolemaster. Things like dodging, parrying, deflecting, closing in, grappling, disarming, tripping, etc. are not specialized skills or feats that one fighter has and another doesn't. They are foundational aspects of fighting itself. Fighting with weapons is not just simple parry and riposte. In my opinion, the role of Game Master is to narrate and describe combat action and results by interpreting the dice rolls and modifiers along with the scene. For example, if a player says something like, I want to stab at that orc just as he raises his axe to chop at me, so I'm grabbing my pommel with my other hand for strength and aim, and I'm shoving my sword right into his exposed armpit to sever his major arteries. To this enthusiastic effort, the Game Master might just respond, yeah, okay, just roll the dice, and then follow the numbers to decide if there was any hit or damage. The Game Master could also try searching for a rule and table covering high outside double-handed arm thrusts aimed at the underarm when employed with a bastard sword against male armor. Or, after looking at the results of the roll and damage, the Game Master could simply reply with something along the lines of, okay, great, as the orc lifts his arm to hack at your head, you make your move and your sword point jams deep into his underarm, splintering some links in his mail armor and finding the meat of his orcish hide and muscle. But his forearm motion disrupts your timing and aim a little bit, and the stab only just wounds him. The tension is sustained, the excitement is allowed to express itself, and realism is embraced. I have my own opinion on this kind of narration of combat and whether or not it helps or whether or not it hurts. And whether or not I find most players like it or not, and how exactly they should relate to the dice rolls. I think that's a whole subject we could talk about on its own. In the orc example here, my issue is that I think that the tension is not sustained through that. The tension is resolved and dissipates as soon as the dice are rolled, because the player knows whether they rolled well and did a lot of damage to that orc or they didn't. That's resolving the tension of that attack. I suppose there might be a little bit of tension as to whether or not the Game Master is going to say, okay, the orc is dead, regardless of how much damage was done or how little was done. If maybe the orc had taken damage earlier in the battle and might only have a couple of hit points left. But at any rate, arguably the tension isn't maintained after the dice roll through the narrative description. I suppose it could work if the Game Master was the one who was rolling the damage dice behind the screen, so the players never knew what the result of the damage die was. Then the narrative description of what happened to the orc would be much more meaningful, intense, and impactful. And although the Game Master is accounting for all of the hit points behind the screen, the players would have to rely on the Game Master's narrative description to understand what had happened to their foe and what else was going on in combat. That's an interesting idea. Because, of course, you do have the great narration that the player here is giving you of what they are going to try to do, but then if you're playing something like AD&D, especially at the time this was written, well, then you're going to roll, and then the Game Master provides this interpretation, this narrative interpretation of the dice roll. A lot of times, though, so many dice are being thrown, what I basically feel is that players want to skip all that, because once the die is rolled and they know how much damage the orc is taking, they want to move on. The nice narrative description of the combat is something that's kind of dragging things out because we've got more dice to roll, and I find that many players don't really want it, and they know that giving their nice flowery description of their attack isn't changing anything mechanical in the game about whether or not they're going to be able to defeat that orc or not. Now, I don't necessarily think that's good. In fact, I think that could be, and arguably is a flaw in some RPG combat systems, like hit point-based systems, particularly inflationary hit point-based systems like Dungeons & Dragons. To others, it won't be. It'll be just fine. And they like it. But I think it could be argued that that's a flaw that gets in the way for this. But I think that's a deeper conversation. But clearly this is what he thinks about adding realism to RPG combat by interpreting the dice rolls. He goes on, though, but arguably very few individuals, even among the community of historical fencing enthusiasts and Renaissance martial artists, have sufficient experience in the subject of historical combat to do this kind of interpretive combat narration, or at least to do it entertainingly for their players. Many lack realistic knowledge of the true characteristics and attributes of genuine historical arms and armor, as well as the actual wounding effects of real weapons on flesh, let alone understanding something of the nature of personal armed combat. And for that matter, they really shouldn't be expected to know either in order to run a good adventure. I kind of think this is a weird paragraph. It is certainly true that most people playing games don't have comprehensive understandings of all of that, and I would say it's also true that you shouldn't be expected to have all of that in order to run a good adventure. And so any system that is relying on a game master or a player to have that, that would definitely be a negative, I would think. I would think in today's world, though, especially with YouTube and a lot of different things, many gamers will have more information on the subject than they did at the time that this essay was written. Oh, look, he does say this essay was revised in 2003, July 12th, 2003. So we're looking at an essay from 2003. So by this time, my gaming group would have made the switch from AD&D over to 3rd edition, and we would have been playing that. He goes on to say, yet there are some basic fundamental truths about historical fencing and the use of arms and armor that I feel can and should be addressed within the combat of serious RPGs. Many game combat systems or specific rules in them are founded upon certain core assumptions regarding arms and fighting that I believe are just plain wrong, and in some cases downright absurd. But while we want to avoid futile attempts to creating a simulation of personal combat in a game, I am strongly convinced gamers can still utilize a large degree of historical source material on fighting to enrich their gaming experience. To use an analogy, consider Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien's writings are exceptional and surely the pinnacle of fantasy literature. Why? Because in creating his world and stories, Tolkien grounded himself in the reality of historical folklore, mythology, and real languages. He didn't sit around and make it all up from scratch. He relied on an incredible wealth of existing materials from which to draw upon. The results speak for themselves. The same needs to be done in RPG combat. And here we have numerous existing, though little-known, resources from historical European martial arts to rely on, and he directs you to the arma.org website. He concludes, personally, like many, I've tried my hand at making my own fantasy role-playing game combat system once or twice in the past. Sometimes I wanted a way whereby I could make my to-hit roll and my damage roll one and the same. Other times I wanted to be able to do it in 2 separate rolls, so I might rely on those wonderful polyhedral dice for the variety of different weapons and monsters. Gotta love those Pythagorean solids. But in each design, I always tried to include the above 5 points in order to approximate the desired feel of realism without sacrificing the necessary feel of a good game. The results were both fun and rewarding. I guess I'll note that I've thought about the same things, and that's probably something that a lot of game designers go back and forth on. Should your hit and damage all be resolved in one roll, or should those be divided out? There are arguments for both, of course, and I'm sure we will get into a lot of them in later videos. So he's probably not unique in going back and forth on that particular design point. So there he does say that about the author, John Clements is one of America's leading instructors and foremost researchers of Renaissance martial arts. He has studied the subject for over 23 years and researched and taught in 6 countries. He's the director of ARMA, the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts, and is the author of Renaissance Swordsmanship, the Illustrated Use of Rapiers and Cut and Thrust Swords, and Medieval Swordsmanship, Illustrated Techniques and Methods, both from Paladin Press. He writes and teaches on historical fencing full-time in Houston, Texas, and occasionally consults for the gaming industry. So okay, that was, I think, an interesting blast from the past. I only vaguely remembered this article, and I think it's an interesting one to go back to. Certainly being from 2003, there have been many more different RPGs and combat systems developed. We're basically swimming in them, and we don't have to just rely largely on AD&D anymore. So it's interesting to see how these different points he brings up manifest in different systems that we have today. And I do think that it's interesting that I have thought about basically all 5 of these points as I've been thinking about designing an RPG system. But then again, lots of RPG designers have to deal with a lot of these points. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. What do you think? Do you have opinions on his commentary? If so, please write it down below. I'll see you in another video.